Chapter 1.6, Unity, Variety, and Balance. The introduction to this chapter tells us that unity refers to the imposition of order and harmony on a design, that variety is the visual diversity of different ideas, media, and elements, and that balance refers to the distribution of elements within a work. If we look more specifically at unity, our text goes on to say that it provides cohesiveness and helps to communicate its visual idea, that artists select and organize materials into a harmonious composition, and last, that there are three kinds of unity: compositional, conceptual, and gestalt. To reiterate, composition is how an artist sort of organizes the various visual elements, using the principles of design onto a two-dimensional surface, or, the way they organize a three-dimensional object to create, in this case, compositional unity. Too much similarity sometimes of any single element or principle of art can turn out to be monotonous, whereas too much variety can mean a lack of structure and the absence of a central idea. So therefore, it's very important to find that kind of sweet spot, right? That balance between, unity and variety. This is a great diagram that sort of goes on to sort of show, how how important it is to find that balance between the two. In A, we have, very much, unity without any sort of variety. And as we move to the right, you sort of gain more variety, and you see how it becomes a much more pleasing composition as we sort of attain that balance between the two. This is an interior design by the I. Michael Interior Design Corporation in Maryland. And, I want you to sort of begin to, when you look particularly at architectural structures, at how, architects go in and start beginning to sort of create design. You want to look at the way line is used, to sort of draw the eye around the space, the repetitions of certain shapes. For example, you have that kind of semi-arch there. You have a rounded arch shape here. The repetition of, squares and sort of trapezoid shapes in different areas, and how these all become part of a central kind of theme, a design. Our text itself goes on to really sort of show how, if we are to sort of pick apart this space and look at it simply through the eyes of the designer, you can begin to see how that use of both unity and variety makes for a very dynamic experience for the eyes of the viewer, the person who visits this space. Next, we have conceptual unity. Our text tells us that this type of unity refers to the cohesive expression of ideas within a work of art. That an artist may link different images that conjure up a single notion, that the artist's ideas and cultural experiences can also contribute to the conceptual unity of a work. This is a wonderful piece from 1945 by Joseph Cornell. It's called Untitled, or also The Hotel Eden. And we see here how using conceptual unity can come about almost happenstance. In this case, Cornell, is an artist that uses assemblage in a lot of his work. When I say assemblage, I mean that he has taken a lot of these disparate elements and assembled them together to create something new. Most of this is stuff that he probably just found in thrift stores or things that people had thrown away. And he has sort of recontextualized these objects by sort of placing them all into a framed box. Uh, uh, you know, with a music box, so it has both a musical element too. You know, all of these objects alone probably didn't have the significance they have once they are put together in this box. Our mind starts jumping from one image to the next, and we begin to attempt to make sense of it, to apply a narrative to it. And that narrative, it probably stems from our own personal experience. You know, what do we think when we look at a bird, right? Like this. When we see the idea of the Hotel Eden, you know, Eden, what does that bring to mind? You know, all of these different objects begin to speak to our subconscious, and we begin to put together this puzzle that is the work by Joseph Cornell. You know, for conceptual unity, it is a construct of how our minds work when we put this together. We apply a conceptual unity to the piece. And lastly, there's what is called a Gestalt unity. Gestalt is a German word for form or shape. And in this case, it refers to something in which the whole seems greater than the sum of its parts, right? The composition and ideas that make the artwork and our experience of that artwork combine to create a Gestalt. We can see an example of a Gestalt unity when we look at this artwork, which is called Vishnu Dreaming the Universe, from somewhere around 450 to 475 CE, or the Common Era. It is a relief panel from the Temple of Vishnu in India, and you know, from a compositional unity aspect, you can see the way that the artist has arranged the figures, you know, in particular ways. You know, if we start to sort of, you know, apply, you know, the idea of it being a composition, you know, you can sort of see how the artist has arranged it in a way that is visually pleasing and is designed in a way to suggest order in the universe, which very much most religious objects tend to be very symmetrical, or have a radial sort of quality about them, to again really push this idea of a religious object being something that kind of provides, you know, order to our universe, right? So, you know, compositionally, all of these sort of elements are sort of put together in a way to really push that. Now, if we look at it from a conceptual side, you know, the artist has put in all of these different elements to sort of remind a person who is a believer or a follower of this particular form of religion, you know, little bits and pieces to sort of, you know, whet the appetite or satiate the appetite of the believer. You know, in that case, in that way, you know, conceptual unity is attained. So with this artwork, we have both compositional unity and conceptual unity holding hands very much equally in the work, and therefore it has achieved a form of Gestalt. It has this beautiful balance of both conceptual and compositional unity. How many of us have heard this idea of variety is the spice of life? I think we as a Western society are very much believers in this idea of the importance of variety in our lives. We spend most of our days trying to fight against the monotony of day-to-day work and day-to-day living. And our book absolutely pushes this notion that variety is very important to the success of an artwork. It tells us that variety is a collection of ideas, elements, or materials that are fused together into one design. and that variety can, in fact, very much invigorate a design. This is an artwork by Robert Rauschenberg called Monogram. And, to sort of understand this piece a little bit and understand Robert Rauschenberg's sort of intention with it, you have to sort of take note that it was made in 1955 to 59. Rauschenberg was a very successful artist that worked at this sort of juncture between two very different time periods in the art world. You have the work of the New York Seven from like the 40s and 50s, the Jackson Pollocks, who were all making these non-representational artworks. And then you have the artists of the 60s and 70s like Andy Warhol, who were sort of reintroducing the use of representational imagery into art through the pop movement. So very, very different movements in art, and you have artists like Rauschenberg who kind of had a little bit of a footing in both sides. And this is a great piece to sort of show where he sort of existed, right? That kind of weird spot between those two ways of thinking about visual art making. He was a painter. And he was a painter at a time when people were looking more at installation work, performance art. And so, almost as a joke, he decided to create this very extreme relief painting that actually sits on the floor. And then you have this taxidermied goat in a tire sitting on top of it. So you have the absurdity almost of Dadaism thrown in against the non-representational aspect of the neo-expressionist from the era before Rauschenberg, all put in together. But it creates this incredibly exciting work. I mean, I think we can't help but feel that it's kind of funny, that it's weird, right? And it's that variety that you see, all of these different types of parts and aspects all sort of thrown in, looped in together, that makes the piece something really special. Interestingly enough, I mean, variety can be used to unify an artwork. An artist can create visual harmony while using a variety of different shapes, colors, values, and other elements. This is an album quilt, probably by a woman named Mary Evans from Baltimore, Maryland in 1848. My grandmother was a quilter. I remember watching her and her friends sitting around on the weekends, working as a hive mind almost, creating these quilts. And they are beautiful objects and are without a doubt sort of these masterful expressions of the use of visual elements and principles of design to create these objects. And you can see here how we have both a unity of, certain shapes that are repeated over and over again, these kind of round shapes that are repeated throughout the work over and over again, which help to create this sort of unity of the piece. But variety also helps to tie it together. The fact that each one of these is a little bit different. No two are the same. They are similar, but not completely the same. And so that variety that sort of exists throughout the whole piece helps to tie the work together, and also, makes the work much more interesting. Our eye sort of can't land on just one thing without moving to the next. It creates this kind of jump that we sort of jump from one image to the next. And the use of similar colors, by that sort of yellow being repeated there and there and there and there and there, again, is another way to sort of unify it together, but it all having sort of different shapes and different elements makes it a more interesting piece. So the variety itself is what unifies the work. When we begin to talk about balance, just as real objects have physical weight, parts of a work of art can have visual weight or impact. Balance provides a visual equilibrium, and helps the work appear complete. We can identify visual balance by noticing different halves, differences between two halves. There are two different types of balance. There is, or three actually: symmetrical, asymmetrical, and radial. Now we're going to first talk about symmetrical balance. If a work can be cut in half and each side looks exactly the same, then it is considered to be symmetrically balanced. Examples include the human body, most animals, and a number of geometric shapes. This is a ritual container by Lu Ding. And again, you can very much see that it is a symmetrically balanced object. If we were to draw a line, in the very middle of this artwork and looked at the two sides, the left side and the right side would be very much the same. Now, this is, as I said earlier, this sort of symmetrical balance is very common in objects that are used for religious ritual. And again, the idea is that symmetry suggests that the universe is ordered. And through our religious beliefs, it is theorized by these different religions that you can sort of find comfort in a universe that is ordered as opposed to chaotic. But we can still achieve balance even with asymmetry. Artists often use different visual weights on each side of a composition. Elements on the left and right sides are not necessarily the same in asymmetrical balance, but the combination counters each other. This is a beautiful ink on paper drawing or painting by Ma Wen called Walking on a Mountain Path in Spring. And, if we look at this work, you can see that if we were to divide the work in half, the left side, is very dense. There is a lot of imagery. And whereas the right side, not so much. You have the bird, you have this text, right? You have just a little bit of information here. And so, definitely it's not symmetrically balanced. It is without a doubt an asymmetrical image, but is it balanced? The way this artist has achieved balance in this work is the fact that, as with many of the works that were created during this time, there is an idea that this is a land of mists and mystery. And for example, like if you look at this top part of this mountain and see how it just sort of fades out, which again really pushes this idea that we are looking off into a distance of atmosphere, and that there actually is, the mountain continues, but we just can't see it. So the balance is created in this work by our imaginations. We fill in the blanks, right? And so even though the artist doesn't choose to draw anything, the artist is giving enough that he or she, in this case he, but allows us to come up with what we think is in the distance. And so we balance this work in our minds, and that's a beautiful thing. I mean, I like art that allows us to do some of the work, I think it's boring for an artwork to sort of give us everything. And so if an artwork is free enough to allow us to make some decisions, I think that can be really a beautiful thing. Now, you can see too how if you think about visual weight, right? Notice how there's not a very rich black on the left side of the painting, whereas on the right with the text that you see in the top, right-hand corner, that really balances out that sort of more lightness on the left side. So again, even though the objects are different and they're not symmetrical, by making some things darker, a small amount of dark can balance out like a lot of sort of a lighter gray. And lastly, we have radial balance. Radial balance or symmetry is achieved when all elements are equally distant from a central point and repeat in a symmetrical way from side to side and top to bottom. It can imply circular and repeating elements. Now, no object better exemplifies, this idea of radial symmetry than a mandala. And if you're not familiar with mandalas, a mandala is basically it is a diagram of the universe. It is largely created within Buddhist cultures, but similar kind of sand paintings can be found within a lot of different cultures from South America to our Native Americans, but this sort of circular radial image is basically, I actually saw one created one time when I was living in Los Angeles, and the Museum of Modern Art had invited a group of Tibetan monks to come and stay in LA for about a month. And they would go every day to the museum, and they would kneel on the floor and using these, they look almost like little spoons. Well, it's more like a combination between a straw and a spoon. And they would pick up little bits of colored sand and sit kind of in a big circle and create these images just by just tapping the straw and allowing little particulates of sand to sort of gather on the ground. So this is all made out of colored sand. So they would spend weeks making it, and then it would stay up for 2 or 3 days for people to come and look at it. And then at the end of the 3 days of showing it, the monks would come in and just sweep it all up. And they would put it in this, it looked like almost an urn, and then they took it down to the ocean and dumped the colored sand into the ocean. And it's really a beautiful concept because it's an idea that, we spend our entire lives building our own personal mandalas, right? Our lives are this sort of accumulation of all this sort of brightly colored, stuff, right? But then at the end, it all goes into the ocean. We throw it away. So it's a very Eastern way of thinking about that the journey is more important than the end result, right? That the journey is the most fascinating part. And anyway, there's several YouTube videos. I'll probably put a link up on the website of a mandala for you to look at, the making of a mandala. And, they're really beautiful, beautiful objects. Not just physically beautiful, but the whole concept of the mandala is, I think, really lovely. And as we close the chapter out, it's important to see how this sort of idea of radial symmetry is not just applied to sort of Eastern philosophies, but also to more Western sort of philosophies. In this case, this is a Villa Rotunda, a church by Andrea Palladio. And you can see how, if we look from above, we can see how this building is really, if we saw it from the sky, it would definitely look like what? A cross, sort of a very ornate cross, right? And you can see how it is designed in a way that everything radiates out from the center, And this is typically there is like an opening at the top called the oculus, which becomes really the eye of God in the center of this sort of cross shape. Uh, Once again, if we stand in the center of this building and we look in all directions, we feel that we live in an ordered universe, that chaos is held at bay by the tenets of religion. And so therefore you can see how radial or various forms of symmetry become an important idea that many religions around the world have sort of grabbed a hold of to use as a way to reinforce their own sort of ideas about how the world works. Chapter 1.7, Scale and Proportion. Our introduction tells us that we perceive scale in relation to our own size. So, in other words, we tend to think of ourselves as sort of this gauge that we sort of relate to everything else in the world. Artists often ensure all parts of an artwork are in correct proportion, but they also use discordant proportions to express meaning. When we think about scale, artists will make conscious choices about scale depending on the message that they want to communicate. They will also consider the cost, the time, and the location that's available. When we think of scale and meaning, works of massive or impressive scale are often considered monumental. Monumental meaning quite large. This type of scale usually indicates heroism or other epic virtues. This is a work by Klaus Oldenburg, called Mistos. And Oldenburg, sort of like the whole central theme of his work, is he would take very mundane objects from our day-to-day life, and recreate them, in a very stylized but monumental fashion. And, to sort of again show that these objects have meanings that can be much greater than, than their simple utilitarian function. In this case, an object that we don't really see as much anymore because people don't smoke like they used to, or they tend to use lighters, but a matchbook. And you can see that these people are actually kind of laying around on the matchbook, and one of the matches is open and on fire. It's an interesting choice, of an object that is sort of, even in 1992, was kind of going away. Uh, but you can kind of see how it changes our whole perspective of what the object can mean. What does a lit matchbook signify? It can signify violence as opposed to arson. Oftentimes matchbooks would be used almost as a timed way to sort of start a fire from a distance. You could light one match and then, walk away, and once it burned down to the other matches, it would sort of, create this very fast fire that could be used to ignite different things in sort of in a negative fashion. But also, what does a flame represent to us? A small flame, a spark. That idea of ingenuity is very central to sort of American thinking. And so Oldenburg is proposing, again, that we bring kind of our own visual language to look at our background, to look at this work and sort of assign a meaning to it. Scale can also be important if it goes in the opposite direction, and not very large, but very small. This is a work by Robert Lostender called The Hummingbirds. And you can kind of, if you look down at the information about the object, you see that it is 1 3/4 inches by 5 5/8 inches. This is blown up. So it is a tiny painting that sort of reduces human beings to the size of a hummingbird. This sort of Lilliputian sort of angle, has been used over and over from the movies to videos of different types to sort of suggest the smallness of humans in the face of nature. So you can see here how, it being very small makes it this sort of beautifully precious object. I mean, we can even go even further to this gentleman who is an artist from New York named Willard Wiegand. And this was actually shown at the Museum of Jurassic Technology in Los Angeles back in the 90s. I saw this piece in person, and it is true. This isn't some sort of Photoshop trickery. And he would actually carve sculptures out of individual strands of hair or clumps of hair, and then actually paint them. He was a scientist by trade, and he was fascinated with microscopes and different kinds of magnifying lenses, and he would use these in order to make these works. So that is the Statue of Liberty, carved out of a strand of hair and then set in the eye of a needle. That's the eye of a needle that you see it there. And when you see these pieces in person, they're in these sort of glass boxes with magnifying lenses on the outside, and the single needle is suspended in the middle of the box. And so through the magnifying lenses, you can see these unbelievably detailed objects that are sort of nestled in the eyes of those needles. They're really incredible. I mean, it's like magic or something. The use of scale really can go even further, as we see in this piece by Jean-Francois Millet called The Gleaners. And, our first glance at this work really would just sort of say that this is sort of a landscape painting showing workers in a field. But if we begin to think about race and, sort of the sort of dark history of race and slavery in this country, and, in this case, this is definitely a rebellious painting. Now, you might say, well, Mr. Akers, what do you mean rebellious? There's not any violence. There's not any protest apparently going on. But Millet himself is making a protest here. I want you to note this figure in the back, the man on the horse. This is the guy that's the overseer, who's making sure that everyone is not only doing their work, but probably doing 10 times the amount of work that they should do. And then you have the workers in the field, these women. The women, because of their scale being so much larger than the person who is quote unquote in power, makes them heroic in the painting. They become the heroes of this narrative, and the small overseer, just by the sort of the stature, the size of how big he is compared to them, shows him as being not just literally small, but conceptually small. That this whole idea of the relationship between the overseer and the workers is a relationship fraught in impropriety, right? That it is wrong, that it is something that we should abhor. And so this is a painting that very much challenges, what at this time in 1857 was a very common thing. It is a rebellious artwork. Hierarchical scale. Artists deliberately use relative size in order to communicate differences in importance, as we just saw in the Malay. Almost always, larger means more important, and smaller means less important. Uh, Beginning with the Narmer palette, and in fact, this is another image of King Narmer, who was sort of the first great Egyptian pharaoh. You always know it's Narmer because you will see him holding, this mace in his hand, and you'll always have sort of a kneeling, submissive person in front of him who's about to get the club. And, but you'll notice, look how the scale of Narmer is so huge, as opposed to his enemy. And then you even have, these would be probably like, servants of Narmer, beneath him. And so the scale itself creates this sort of importance of certain figures, whereas you have then the less important figures also in the work. The Egyptians were very much, anytime we start talking about hierarchical scale, you're always safe to look at Egypt, because Egyptians used this sort of idea throughout the 4,000 years of their empire. This is the palette of Narmer. And basically, the palette of Narmer, and I mentioned in an earlier video that, the interesting thing about the Egyptian empire, civilization, is that art didn't change very much at all over the course of their predominance. And the reason for that was the idea that these kings, in this case Narmer, were actually sort of avatars of God, of a God force. And so therefore they were infallible. And if they believed that something was perfect, a certain type of art, a certain style of art, then you would never change it, because if you changed it, you were basically saying that your God was not infallible, that your God was imperfect because they made a mistake. If they said this was perfect, but then we make something that's more perfect, well, then that God must have made a mistake, and gods can't make mistakes, right? So the Narmer palette, in a palette, basically in this case, a palette was a small object, or, well, actually this is 25 by 16, so, like the size of a big iPad or something. But they were actually these flat stones that an Egyptian would take makeup and basically use this palette as a place to sort of mix the colors of the makeup before they would apply them to their face and bodies. So it's a very personal utilitarian object. But in this case, this palette becomes the foundation of thousands of years of Egyptian art, because this was Narmer's personal palette. It is, what he approved of as far as what art should look like, using hierarchical scale and certain types of imagery. And so whenever Egyptian artists made work, they had to think back to the Narmer palette and make work that would sort of fit in with that style of art making. But, hierarchical scale, doesn't really go away. I mean, this is a piece by the great Northern Renaissance painter Jan van Eyck, called Madonna in a Church. And, if you've ever been in a great Catholic cathedral, you'll realize, that if a person were in this building, they would be about that tall. That's how large these cathedrals are. So look at this unbelievably titanic scale of the Virgin Mary in this church. Look how large she is. And of course, that is basically sort of saying that, the Virgin Mary is this, huge part of our religion, that she stands above us all, that she is the grand mother that holds us all like small babies in her arms, right? She is our mother. And this goes back to the Greeks were the same way. If you went, for example, into the Parthenon in Athens, you would actually have seen this large statue of Athena, the goddess Athena, who would probably have been about the same size as we see here with the Virgin Mary in this church, the Madonna. So you can kind of see how a hierarchical scale is so important, again, to sort of push narrative. This is all about trying to visually teach sort of, truths, quote unquote, of these different religious ideas. Distorted scale is another way that artists can sort of get a certain type of meaning across. An artist may deliberately distort scale to create an abnormal or supernatural effect. This is a wonderful surrealist painting by Dorothea Tanning. And in the work from 1943, you can kind of see how there are, at first glance, we might just sort of walk by this painting and not really look at it. But what a lot of surrealist paintings do is they force us to really take some time and begin to look at it as a puzzle that we can start to pick apart. And we start seeing, this always reminds me of The Shining, the Overlook Hotel, because you have this obvious sort of public, living area, whether it be apartments or a hotel itself. You have this mysterious open door with this bright light coming out. You have this young woman standing here with her hair floating like she's actually underwater, right? You have this other young girl who's leaning sort of against nothing because this, bit of trim is way too shallow for her to sort of be putting all her weight against. So it's almost like there's this other object behind her, and then this giant, gerbera that is laying on the ground that is unnaturally big. All of these different elements really sort of make this dreamlike space. And that is really what surrealism was all about. Surrealism which surreal means strange and dreamlike. And surrealists were all sort of interested in making paintings about the dreamscape of human beings, the workings of the mind of human beings and how we put information together. And this is, a great example of that very thing. Proportion is the relationship between the sizes of different parts of a work. It can enhance expressive and descriptive characteristics. This is a diagram that kind of gives us an idea of how proportion works. When we think of proportion, we tend to think about how one part of an object relates to another. In this case, we're thinking about how the proportion changes on vertical and horizontal axes. You have the height, and then you compare the height to the width to sort of get a general idea of the proportions of this particular vase. Then once you have that information, you can compare it to other vases, right? You can say, well, now this vase has this proportion, whereas this has a different proportion. Artists oftentimes use human proportion when they are making artworks. I think we've probably all seen videos of an artist out in the field, painting a painting of a landscape or maybe a tree or something, and you'll see them put their hand out and stick their thumb up and maybe turn the thumb left and right. Well, basically what that person is doing, that artist is doing, is using visual measurement as a way to sort of reproduce what they see in the world onto their canvas. Like if they hold their thumb up and they're looking at a tree off in the distance, they can sort of say, okay, well, if I compare it to my thumb, from where I'm standing, that tree is, let's count down, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 thumbs. So I can then say on my paper, it needs to be 7 thumbs tall. So they can kind of use that relationship between their own bodies and what they're looking at as a way to accurately understand the proportion of an object. Ancient Greeks investigated the mathematical basis of beauty and ideal proportion. To them, these proportions embodied the perfection of the gods. Now, proportions can oftentimes be deliberately skewed to, again, reinforce the supernatural or otherworldliness of a subject. This is a beautiful object. It's a Nigerian Ife, a figure of Oni. And you can see this sort of the enlarged head, the scale isn't correct. The whole body is like, in this case, the proportions would be like 3 heads high, and so the overlarge feet, it is to create an object that, in the artist, you can tell by the beautiful, perfect way that the work is sculpted. The artist understands proportions. They understand looking at something and reproducing it accurately. But instead, they decide that they are going to distort the proportions to make the object something that is different than human, something more a god. The golden section is also referred to as the golden mean. The golden section is a proportional ratio of 1 to 1.618. It is found over and over again throughout the natural world. Like if you take a nautilus shell and you break down the little chambers in the shell as it goes around a spiral, each jump in size from one chamber to the next is it jumps 1.618 times larger each time it gets bigger. Now, human bodies don't have these exact proportions, but when applied to statues, they can give very naturalistic results. This is a diagram that sort of shows the sort of golden section and how it sort of fits into artworks. If you are to create a canvas, either as a landscape or as a portrait, using the sort of golden section as a way to sort of determine the scale of the painting. For example, if you took the width of the painting and then multiplied the width by times 1.618 and made that the height, it would visually create a picture plane that is automatically pleasing to the viewer. We subconsciously see that proportion and we are drawn to it because we understand that it is something that is used, in a plethora of ways in the natural universe. This is an artwork called Poseidon or Zeus. We're not totally sure which of the two guys it is because someone, stole, if it had been, a trident in his hand, then that would have been Poseidon, right? Or if it had been a lightning bolt in his hand, then it would have been Zeus. But probably that object was made out of gold, and at some point somebody said, I'd rather have the gold than I'd have that statue. And so they took it and melted it down and sold. So we don't know because we don't know what he's holding, whether that's Poseidon or Zeus. But our book goes on to show us how that sort of golden section exists in this sculpture and why it is such a pleasing physical object. You can see the scale from, this part of the arm to the lower part of the arm and hand is 1 to 1.618. The scale from the torso to then the leg, the lower torso and legs is 1.618. So these proportions are used over and over and over again. The navel becomes like this sort of central line that divides, that kind of perfect scale, So you can kind of see in this way how, the golden section becomes so important to the making of art. And this carries through even to today. A lot of artists really do believe in the golden section, and when they make art, they really do apply these kind of mathematical ideas to the foundations of the objects that they're making. Proportional ratios, these golden rectangles have these, like we just said, these proportions of 1 to 1.618. They are nestled inside each other. The shorter side of the outer rectangle becomes the longer side of the smaller one. And it results in a very elegant spiral shape. If we look at this very dramatically staged photograph by Henry Peach Robinson called Fading Away that depicts the death of a daughter, which was very common in 1858. It was something that a lot of people had experienced, the death of a family member from plague. And if we begin to sort of break it down geometrically, we can kind of see how, again, that golden ratio exists in the work to create, that scale that is repeated over and over. And the artist even goes so far then as to repeat certain aspects, that kind of arch that we see here, is repeated in the art, a little bit in the fabric. The placement of the figures sort of fall within these sort of ratio boxes. So, and notice then, you have how straight this figure is, the way he is standing as he looks out the window, repeats that sort of line of this, as if we break it down into these golden rectangles, these boxes, is this repetition. So again, here, this is a perfect example, as you can see this proportional analysis of this artwork and how the artist has actually considered this, whether consciously or subconsciously, to create an interesting composition. This is the Parthenon by Iktinos and Kallikrates. And, again, this sort of use of scale and the golden rectangles to sort of create this object, to create a very pleasing shape. Greeks applied proportional systems to both architecture as well as sculpture. The proportions of the Parthenon correspond very closely to that golden section. The vertical and horizontal measurements together create this harmonious design. And this diagram really does show us again how that golden section is applied over and over again within the design of the Parthenon. Here, even, in small areas, you have that golden section, and then you have it in the entire piece itself. If we look at one side and divide it up, it becomes very much you can easily see how it fits within that golden section. So this ends this video. If you have any questions, reach out to me at cakers@lee.edu, and I will get back to you just as soon as is humanly possible. Thank you.